Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the program where we take a deep dive into the stack of sources that make you well-informed. I'm your host, and today we are looking at something, well, something a lot of us just skim right past.
Oh, for sure. We're in Genesis 11, specifically verses 18 and 19.
The genealogy of Peleg and Reu. And if you're reading through the Bible, this is one of those places where the narrative momentum just seems to, well, it just deflates.
Right. It feels like you hit a wall of names and numbers.
Exactly. You've just come off this huge, spectacular story, the Tower of Babel, and then suddenly you're slammed into what feels like, I don't know, spiritual bookkeeping.
That's a good way to put it.
So our mission for this deep dive is to show that these verses are absolutely not filler. They're not just a bridge.
No, they're packed with meaning.
They are vital narrative direction. They show us something central about how God governs history, that his kingdom doesn't advance through the noise of Babel.
Right. Not through human spectacle.
It advances through quiet, patient providence, through the ordinary march of years. We're looking at sources from the biblical text, of course, but also some historical critiques on how genealogies function. And the goal here is to show you that if you learn to read these two short verses the right way, it actually gives you a much stronger confidence in God's methodical, promise-keeping faithfulness.
It's all about that quiet drumbeat of grace, isn't it?
It is, especially when you hold it up against the roar of human pride.
And that contrast is absolutely key. The first thing you notice when you pull up the sources is the placement. Genesis 11.1819 sits right after one of the loudest, most dynamic stories in all of primeval history.
No.
Babel. The judgment in Genesis 11.19. The shift in tone is jarring, and it's completely intentional.
So what was Babel all about? I mean, really?
It was human resolve at a fever pitch. Their whole vocabulary was about action, about self-sufficiency.
Come, let us build.
Let us make a name for ourselves. It was this attempt to manufacture their own security, their own salvation, really, through human ingenuity, a literal ladder to heaven.
A proud, loud ascent.
Yes. And some of the historical analyses we looked at point out this wasn't unusual in the ancient world. You see monumental architecture all over the place, serving political and religious ends.
So God's opposition isn't because building itself is evil.
Not at all. It's because their unity, their entire project, was an explicit corporate act of rebellion.
They were trying to secure their own future apart from God's instruction.
Exactly. Instead of filling the earth as commanded, they were consolidating their power. And what happens?
Human autonomy is shown for what it is, an illusion.
God withdraws, is sustaining mercy in one key area, their speech, and the whole thing collapses. The world fragments, people scatter. That's the noise.
And then silence.
Well, not silence, but a sudden shift. The scripture moves from this huge, chaotic map of humanity, the 70 nations spreading out, to this single, narrow data stream.
The history of Shem, starting in Genesis 11, verse 10. Right.
And for the modern reader who's just used to scrolling past data, the immediate question is why? Why spend all that narrative energy on Babel's spectacle just to hit the brakes and start listing names?
That's the perfect question to ask, and the answer is deeply theological. Some of the more skeptical sources we reviewed will argue this is just, an ethnographic device, a dry census of clans.
It's just political record-keeping.
But that completely misses the dramatic power of what the narrator is doing.
Which is?
This narrowing right after the catastrophe of Babel shows that God is not just reacting to human sin. He is actively advancing his purposeful line.
So even as the world falls apart,
God is holding a single thread together. Sin and judgment lead to scattering, but God's redemptive purpose is always moving toward gathering, moving toward the seed who will crush the serpent's head from Genesis 3.15.
Okay, so this genealogy is really a bridge text.
It's a critical bridge. It's connecting the universal history of Genesis 1 through 11, Adam, Noah, the flood, Babel, with the very particular history of the patriarchs that starts right after in Genesis 12.
It's the artery that carries the lifeblood of the promise. And it's not an arbitrary path either. It's rooted in Noah's prophecy from chapter 9.
Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem.
That's the one. That was the theological designation of the line that would carry the knowledge of Yahweh. And this genealogy shows that prophecy playing out in the real world of years and births.
So God is preparing a specific family through whom blessing will eventually return to all those scattered families from Babel.
Yes, and the bridge is built out of these seemingly unremarkable names, Peleg, Reu, because God's covenant dealings always enter real history through actual people.
Not through abstract ideas.
No, through flesh and blood.
Hmm.
So when the text names Peleg and Ru, it's quietly demonstrating the continuity of that promise. It's God's careful providence, not man's boastful, spectacular management.
The judgment on Babel is followed immediately by this quiet display of grace and control.
Which you can see in the very structure of the verses.
Okay, let's unpack that, because you're right. The form itself is sending a message. When you look at Genesis 11, verses 18 and 19, you see this deliberate four-part rhythm repeated over and over.
A liturgical beat almost.
Yeah, and modern readers, we're so addicted to speed and drama, we just dismiss it as boring data. But the repetitiveness is the message. It's a steady, providential drum beat.
Let's walk through it.
So this four-step structure is used for Peleg, his son Ru, and it gets repeated all the way down to Abram. It goes something like 1, the time anchor, X lived a set number of years.
Right.
2, what you could call the hinge of promise, and fathered Y. 3 is the extended life. After he fathered Y, X lived many more years. And then 4, this little contextual footnote, and fathered sons and daughters.
Let's start with that first and third part, the chronological anchors.
Peleg lived 30 years and then lived 209 years.
Those clauses ground redemption in real, verifiable human history. It's so crucial that Scripture speaks in these plain categories: age, years, decades.
It keeps it from becoming a myth.
Exactly. It's not some abstract once-upon-a-time story. This is happening on our calendar, so to speak.
Wow.
Our days are counted, they're measured by the Lord. And this constant counting teaches us something about our own lives.
That they aren't infinite.
They're not infinite, they're not self-owned, and they're not aimless. The counting is this persistent, quiet reminder of our limitations as creatures.
I have to pause here because one of the critical sources we looked at would raise a flag right here.
Okay.
In Genesis 5, in that genealogy, the refrain is always there, and he died. It closes out each life. But here in Genesis 11, that phrase is missing.
It's a notable omission.
Right. So someone could look at that and say, it's an incomplete record. Why is that choice so intentional?
Because the purpose of the list has changed. In Genesis 5, the pattern is tragic. It's birth, life, begetting, and then the finality of death. It's a lament about mortality under the curse.
But here, the function is different.
Completely different. The omission of "and he died" actually speeds up the narrative flow. The text is almost rushing. It's saying, don't stop and mourn here, keep moving forward.
It's driving the reader past these individuals.
Yes, toward a specific destination, Abram. The structure itself is saying the promise is coming into focus, the story is accelerating toward the covenant. It creates a sense of forward momentum.
That's a great point. It's like a fast-forward button. Okay, what about the second part, the hinge? And fathered Ru. You said this verb is covenantal. Can you break that down?
Absolutely. Think of it less as just a biological event and more like an official designation of succession. In this specific context, the Hebrew verb isn't just stating a fact. It's communicating an act of divine appointment carried out through ordinary human biology.
This is where the selectivity comes in.
This is exactly it. Peleg undoubtedly had other children. We'll get to that. But the narrator names Ru, and only Ru. Not because he was the most famous or the wisest or even the firstborn. We don't know.
He's named because he is the chosen link.
He is the necessary next link in this very specific chain. And that quiet act of naming Ru stands in direct opposition to the loud noise of Babel.
How so?
Babel tried to find security in a human structure, a tower built on ambition. God's security is given through a lineage, not human achievement, but divine designation, carried forward through the birth of this specific son, Ru.
Okay, that brings us to the last clause, that theological footnote, and fathered sons and daughters. If the whole point is to narrow the focus to the covenant line, why add this detail? It almost seems to dilute the point.
It guards against a really big misunderstanding. If the text only listed Ru, you might think Peleg only had one child, or worse, that God's providence is restricted only to this one tiny line.
I see.
By including sons and daughters, the text affirms Peleg had a full life, a broad household. It affirms that God's governance extends to all families. Life is abundant, it's continuing all over the world.
So it's a quiet declaration that God is still Lord of all those scattered nations from Babel.
He is. But the immediate naming of Ru keeps the narrative direction laser-focused. So the genealogy does two things at once. It affirms the abundance of God's general providence while maintaining a sharp focus on the particular path of the promise.
It's an incredible piece of narrative economy when you see it that way.
It is. These aren't exhaustive census records. They are guided testimonies. They give us only the data needed to trace the path to the Redeemer.
Okay, let's talk about the men themselves, Peleg and Reu. When we look at them, or rather what the text doesn't say about them, we see this crucial principle. I think you could call it significance without celebrity.
That's perfect.
The sources tell us nothing. There are no heroic deeds, no moral report card, no great crises they navigated. All we know is their lifespan, their fatherhood, and their place in the line.
And that lack of color is the point. It's intentional. It shifts our attention completely away from any kind of human achievement and puts it squarely on the faithfulness of God that is sustaining their lives.
And we have to remember the context of Peleg's life.
Yes, this is huge. Genesis 10:25 tells us that in Peleg's days, the earth was divided. His name itself sounds like the Hebrew word for division.
So he was living in the direct aftermath of Babel.
He's living in a world defined by fragmentation, confusion, scattering. The whole global atmosphere is one of loss and chaos.
So his significance isn't that he was some great leader who fixed it all.
Absolutely not. His significance is that God preserved his family line without any interruption right in the middle of all that division. The promise continued even when history looked like a total mess.
That speaks so directly to our modern world. We live in an age that equates significance with visibility, with having a platform.
With scale.
With scale, exactly.
Yeah.
If your work is quiet and routine, we're tempted to think it just doesn't count for much.
Mm-hmm.
And Peleg and Reu are this quiet rebuke to all of that platform thinking. They didn't make a name for themselves.
No, they received a name that was designed to serve a much bigger name. Named the Lord who keeps covenant mercy.
They weren't asked to build a skyscraper. They were asked to live and raise a family.
And that slow architecture of providence is the divine alternative to Babel's proud architecture. Babel was a project for immediate, loud fame. God's response is quiet, slow, methodical, carried out through births and generations.
So their lives preach a sermon, really.
They do. They preach that long, ordinary faithfulness matters. Managing a household, meeting your family responsibilities, steady work, patient perseverance. God often advances his saving purposes through means the world would completely overlook.
It's humbling. It tells us that we might not see the kingdom advancing with our own eyes, but it absolutely is. We might not hear the trumpets, but the promise is marching forward through the mundane rhythm of human life.
It is.
So let's shift a bit and talk about what these sparse verses tell us about God's methodology. Not just listing themes, but what does this genealogical method reveal about God's character and how he sustains his plan?
Well, the first big insight is about how God operates in history. His providence is revealed in this ordinary succession. That repeated cadence, the numbering of years, the recording of fatherhood, is a literary insistence that history moves by ordered succession.
Not by chance, not by chaos.
Not at all. Peleg's time is measured, his fatherhood is recorded. We tend to think of providence only in these big, dramatic interventions.
Like the flood or the judgment at Babel.
Right. But these verses show us that providence is primarily God's quiet governance. It's so steady, so constant, that we can mistake it for just ordinary life.
God is assumed in the timing of a life, in the arrival of a child.
Yes. The everyday, routine function of the family becomes the theater of the Almighty.
That really reframes how we should look at our own daily routines. If God's method is the quiet rhythm, then we should expect to find him in the quiet rhythm of our own days.
That's right. And a second insight here is about continuity through sovereign selection. This genealogy is proof that God carries his promise forward by his own choosing. He preserves this selected line through people the world would definitely consider unremarkable.
It confronts our whole meritocratic way of thinking.
It really does. This idea that the future belongs to the famous or the powerful or the strategically brilliant, Scripture just rejects that. Reu is named precisely because he is the selected link in God's chosen chain. And that selection has nothing to do with his visibility or prestige.
God doesn't hitch the success of his covenant to human accomplishment.
If he did, it would have failed spectacularly at Babel. He carries it forward by his sovereign election. He chooses who lives, how long they live, and who they beget. And there's immense confidence for us in that.
That leads right into a third insight, one that I think corrects a lot of our modern thinking about church and family.
The value of ordinary means.
The value of God's ordinary means. As you said, there's no miracle reported here, no prophet, no big public victory. The event is fatherhood, followed by decades of stable family life.
And that's divine instruction. It's showing us that God's saving purpose moves forward primarily through these stable, created rhythms. Family, household continuity, one generation teaching the next.
This stands against what we could call the Babel impulse in modern ministry.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this obsession with speed, with innovative techniques, with spiritual spectacle, the moment we start relying on human engineering to secure our future, we're just building a new kind of Babel.
That's a strong word, but it's true. Genesis 11:18-19 urges us to trust the slow, certain pattern of one generation nurturing the next, to trust the process that looks slow and boring because we know God's hand is in it.
And the fourth observation is about human limitation and humility. It's built right into the math of the text.
The counting of years.
The constant counting. It teaches that life is bounded.
Yeah.
Peleg lived 30 years, then 209 more. The time passes, the generations turn over. We are not permanent.
We are creatures living by God's allowance, serving purposes that are much bigger than our own finite plans.
And that reality just humbles Babel's whole assumption. Stability isn't secured by our effort. Continuity is granted solely by God through a succession of temporary lives. We're links in the chain, not the chain itself.
And you see this elegant balance in the text. We touched on it earlier. It holds together this idea of fruitfulness, sons and daughters, and this narrative narrowing without any contradiction.
It affirms God's expansive rule over all of human life.
Even as he moves with absolute precision along one narrow track toward redemption, we have to remember that dual focus. We worship the God who is Lord of the entire human story, including all the dispersed nations, yet he is also the covenant Lord who moves with absolute historical precision.
Which brings us to the canonical reading, the big picture. This whole genealogy is the historical one-way connecting that first glimmer of hope in Genesis 3.15.
The promised seed.
Directly to the clear, explicit covenant promises God gives to Abram in Genesis 12.
Yes. If you look at it structurally, God's answer to the world's fragmentation at Babel is not to endorse another impressive human building project. His answer is to initiate his own sovereign I will promises to Abram.
And the genealogy proves that the Abrahamic covenant didn't just drop out of the sky.
Not at all. It wasn't a random event. It landed on the precise designated path God had been quietly building for centuries through the lives of men like Peleg and Reu.
So the repetition Peleg fathers Reu, who fathers Serug, and so on. It's like a literary guarantee.
It's data integrity. It's telling the reader with absolute certainty the promise is being carried. It has not been lost.
And the New Testament writers, they didn't see these lists as something to be embarrassed about or skipped over. They depended on this historical continuity.
They absolutely did. Matthew starts his gospel with a genealogy. His first declaration is that Jesus is the Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That statement only has weight if you accept the validity of this historical line traced right through Genesis 11.
And Luke takes it even further.
He does. He traces Jesus' human lineage all the way back through Peleg and Reu to Adam. Both gospel writers are making the same point with crystal clarity. The Christ we proclaim is not some religious symbol floating above history.
He's the promised descendant.
The heir apparent who moved through these specific, seemingly unremarkable lives to get here.
This brings the whole thing to a sharp point. If Babel is, let's say, the gospel of climbing man trying to ascend by technique and effort,
then God's answer is the gospel of descent.
Exactly. The Babel story records that the Lord came down to judge human pride.
But the New Testament declares that the eternal Son came down in mercy to save sinners.
Babel brought scattering, confusion, division.
And Christ brings gathering, clarity, and reconciliation. Babel was a counterfeit attempt to get an everlasting name.
And Christ receives the name above every name by the Father's sovereign decree.
The quiet generations of Genesis 11 were the preparation for this ultimate saving descent.
So these verses, they really function as a critical correction to some of our common and I think wrong assumptions. The first error they correct is that these genealogies are just disposable.
They're dead space.
Yeah, that we can just rush through them. But the Spirit didn't inspire filler. These verses are theological navigation. They tell us exactly where the redemptive story is headed.
To skip them is to refuse to follow the precise line of promise God is intentionally drawing across history.
And second, it corrects the idea that only the big, visible moments count.
The temptation of spectacle.
Right. We are constantly tempted to measure God's presence by drama or novelty or immediate results.
And Genesis 11:18-19 is a rebuke to that impatience. It demonstrates that God is perfectly at work in the plain cadence of years and births. It stands against both the pragmatism that demands instant scale and the sensationalism that demands constant, extraordinary feeling.
It teaches us contentment in the rhythm of the regular.
It does.
But the most direct correction, the one that probably hits closest to home for us today, is against the Babel instinct itself.
The need to make a name.
that desperate need to secure our identity and our future through our own ambitious projects.
And the genealogy answers, with no fanfare at all, that our future isn't secured by our towers. It's secured by God's patient, meticulous providence and promise. Our job isn't to build a name, but to faithfully transmit the name we've been given.
So let's bring this down to application. What do we do with this?
The first, most practical step is to repent of despising the ordinary. The routine of prayer, the steady gathering for worship on the Lord's Day, the quiet daily struggle against a habitual sin.
We're tempted to see those as less spiritual.
Always.
Yeah.
We think they're less spiritual than a dramatic mission trip or some sudden emotional breakthrough. But the God who numbered Peleg's years and preserved his promise through that quiet household is the same God who sanctifies us through these steady means.
So if we want actual spiritual progress, we have to honor God's established means, no matter how routine they feel.
We have to. The world pressures us to curate a brand, to make our mark, to be memorable. The gospel calls us to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow in quiet faithfulness. We have to actively fight that restlessness that craves novelty.
And the pride that craves recognition.
Yes, and learn to value steady, reliable stewardship.
The passage also has so much to say about generational faithfulness, for families and for churches.
It does. Peleg fathered Reu and then sons and daughters. That simple fact dignifies the household as one of God's primary arenas of providence.
It's an instruction to parents, isn't it?
A powerful one. It calls them to reject the cultural habit of outsourcing spiritual formation. That quiet work of teaching, of talking about God's truths when you sit at home, when you walk along the road.
That slow work is central.
It is. This text reminds us that the primary means of covenant transmission is the faithful household over time.
And for churches.
Churches, likewise, should resist the temptation to structure their ministries around spectacle and high-energy technique, as if our main job is to keep people from dispersing by entertaining them.
Babel tried to keep people together with an impressive project.
And Christ builds his church by his word, by prayer, by steady shepherding, and by the slow, faithful making of disciples one generation at a time.
And the structure of these verses, it just gives us a gospel-shaped humility, the rhythm of lived, fathered, continued life. It reminds us we are not the protagonists of history.
Our lives are bounded, our projects will end, but God's promise does not fail.
Which is humbling because it shatters the illusion that our significance is self-made. And it's comforting because it says the success of redemption doesn't rest on our brilliance or efficiency.
It rests entirely on God's sovereign faithfulness. If the Lord carried his purposes through the quiet, fragmented years of Peleg and the simple birth of Reu, then we can have complete assurance today. He can be trusted with the entire sweep of his plan and with the details of your personal life.
The line didn't break. The promise was not lost.
It was not.
So we've seen that Genesis 11:18 and 19, they answer Babel's loud roar with the steady drumbeat of grace sovereign, patient, and absolutely methodical.
God didn't need a spectacle to keep his word. He just needed one man to live and to father a son who was in the line of promise.
He just continued, steadily and covenantally, moving his promise forward through the ordinary means of generation and time.
Peleg fathers Reu, and the line marches on. Not because Peleg was famous or built anything notable, but because God is faithful to his word across generations.
So the world pressures you every single day to make your name, to secure your future through visible ambition and high-speed efficiency. But the study of this genealogy teaches that true security rests not in what you build, but in the God who faithfully governs your generations toward the return of Christ.
So here's the final thought for you to take away. If God's purpose was so sure that he carried it through decades that look like nothing more than births and years, what specific ordinary faithfulness is he calling you to today?
In your family, in your local church, in your quiet personal life.
What is that thing you might be tempted to overlook because it seems too small, too slow? What slow step can you take with confidence today?
Trust the steady beat of providence. We appreciate you joining us for this deep dive into these quiet yet essential verses of Genesis.
We hope to have you back next time on Reformed Thinking.